Okay. So this paper is called The Offence-Defence Balance of Scientific Knowledge. Does publishing AI research reduce misuse? And the paper is by, I see there's a strange imperfection here, but the authors are Toby Shevlane and Alan Defoe. And they presented this paper at a conference held in New York in February this year. Okay, one moment. Good. These are the authors, and I apologize that I've got some alignments wrong on these slides. I cannot account for that. They were perfect just now. But anyway, the first author is Shevlane at the top there, and he both the authors are at the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford. And I think that Shevlane's specialization is in law. He's the guy at the top. And the other fella, Alan Defoe, is the director of the Center for the Governance of AI at FHI. Now, excuse me, I'm just going to have to adjust that. You can probably hear that we're applauding the key workers in the background. You can probably hear the noise. So this paper is concerned with the balance of offense and defense, the balance between two possible effects of disclosing technological knowledge, either facilitating misuse of the technology or contributing to protections against misuse. They say that the balance between the good and bad results of publishing will vary across scientific fields. They say that the existing conversation within AI specifically has imported concepts and conclusions from prior debates within computer security, specifically, over the disclosure of software vulnerabilities. And in that field, they say that publication of information generally favors defense against misuse, and that it's not necessarily appropriate to carry ideas from software security into AI research, and that the AI research community should consider concepts and policies from a broad set of adjacent fields. And they say that the field of AI is in the midst of a discussion about this topic nowadays, and that everybody is concerned about a range of potential misuses, including this familiar list of possible abuses, using facial recognition for targeting vulnerable populations, using synthetic language and video to impersonate human beings and to impersonate them deceptively, using algorithmic decision-making, which can amplify biases and unfairness, using AI in drones to disrupt air traffic, to launch attacks. So those are familiar. Then they talk about the example of text generation, and text generation is an area of AI, and they say that the discussion of this has been influenced by the discussion of software vulnerabilities in general. Now, recently, OpenAI released their GPT-2 model, of text generation caused great stir, and they adopted a policy of staged release because of concerns about its potential misuse to mass produce plausibly human written text. This staged release has long been practiced in computer security. If somebody spots a flaw in a piece of software, whether it's the producer of the software or whether it's some outside user, this is generally released to the public. But after some delay, when it's first made available to the producer, so the producer can fix it, and then the public at large gets to know about it. So returning to OpenAI and their release of GPT-2, people criticized OpenAI using such arguments as that malicious actors would find it easy to build their own model anyway, so that there was no point in delaying the release of the code, that knowledge of the possibilities for attack is useful for preparing defenses, so that there should have been full disclosure anyway, and that, quote, security through obscurity, unquote, is ineffective. And I take it that in this context, security through obscurity just means, well, if you don't talk about, if you just keep your software to yourself, if you keep the code to yourself, then nobody else will want to copy it and release it. They say that that wouldn't make much sense. Another piece of software that came out quite recently is called Grover, and that was designed to generate disinformation or fake news. This was published alongside code for building the model and constructing or reconstructing its data set that had been, presumably the data set had been trained on. And the researchers would actually make further information available to anybody who chose to contact them. And finally, the code and data set were open sourced. The intention behind doing this, of course, was to increase our understanding of AI generation of fake news, so that we could build tools that could guard against the harm it could do. Now, talking about offence-defence amongst technologies generally, they say that the field of international relations has an existing body of literature on such a balance. They actually cite very little, but, oh, excuse me, didn't need to move on. But one example they cite is by Shapiro and Siegel, and they analyze when states should publish information, even though it might be useful to terrorists. For example, a government might wonder whether to publish weaknesses in commercial nuclear power plants. And those authors, Shapiro and Siegel, find that it's safer to disclose such information if you think that attackers already hold such knowledge anyway, so that you're not making a difference. And it's also safer to disclose it if the government that's disclosing it, because it's always governments in the case of nuclear technology, if they can use this openness to find and fix weaknesses. So, I mean, those are two intuitively obvious considerations about when it might be wise to release such information. So our authors, Chevelain and Defoe, want to produce a theoretical framework that covers technologies in general, and I suppose other areas of expertise, but technologies in general, and they're going to apply it to AI specifically a bit later. And they say the net effect of disclosure on misuse depends on which of the two effects is stronger, the effect of aiding actors who want to cause harm and aiding actors who want to protect others from harm. And the balance between those two will be different for different types of disclosure. And just before launching into it, they say that their analysis is limited in scope, only deals with certain consequences of disclosure. And they're only talking about harms that are a direct intentional use of the technology. They're not talking about cases where technology is used incautiously or contains an unsafe defect. So they're not talking about technological accidents. They're not talking about structural risks from technological proliferation, such as military instability or unemployment, all those important topics. But they are only talking about these deliberate, intentional, malicious uses. And their framework does not weigh the benefits of publishing scientific results other than how they relate to security. They have a bit more to say about this at the end. However, so this balance, and I'm sorry you don't, it looks as if you can't see the very last line here, but what that last line is saying is, therefore, our framework should not be the basis for an assessment of publication norms, but only one input to such an assessment. In other words, there is more to the question of publishing than just questions of risk and security. Of course, if you think that we're talking about existential risks, you might not agree with that. You might think that security is the be-all and end-all. But they don't use the phrase existential risk at all in their paper. Okay, some fact now. What follows begins by being extremely abstract. This is an abstract analysis of benefits and harms and different types of cause and effect. But there are a few concrete examples to lighten things up as we go on. So don't give up entirely. Okay, factors where disclosure affects the attacker's capacity to cause harm. The first is called counterfactual possession. That is a jargon phrase that I thoroughly dislike. It just means possession of some piece of knowledge that's achieved independently of it being disclosed. In other words, you think that some bad person out there is going to get this knowledge anyway, so you might as well publish. So, as they say, the more likely it is that this will be achieved, the less impact the publication will have. Another factor that affects the attacker's capacity to cause harm is whether potential attackers, is the fact that potential attackers have three main avenues to achieve so-called counterfactual possession. In other words, independent possession. Independent discovery, or sharing information amongst themselves, and so-called counterfactual publication. That is, someone else will publish soon, so there's no point in holding back. And the authors say that we believe these considerations should be excluded from the decision. If you're thinking about whether to disclose a piece of knowledge in AI research, you should discount these factors above. Instead of considering the impact of an individual decision to publish, researchers should ask, what decision would I want rolled out across the whole field? In other words, they should do what they would be happy for everybody to do in similar situations. This is very Kantian, if you know your Immanuel Kant. More factors affecting an attacker's capacity. And that is the ability of the attackers to absorb and apply the research. And of course, this has got a person considering whether to disclose some research has got to make their own judgment as to what they think potential attackers be able to do with it. The attacker's attentiveness and comprehension, is anybody paying attention? I assume that in the end, nothing goes unnoticed. So we've got to assume that everything will be noticed. But anyway, they say, will the research be read and understood by potential attackers? This will also depend on the disclosure itself. How much knowledge is disclosed? Through what channel? How is it presented? And then there's the question of, is what you presenting sufficient to be used for harm? Does it contain all that is needed to carry out the harmful behavior? At the other end of the spectrum, adopting the research will involve a large investment in resources and complementary knowledge. In other words, this is the case where it would need a huge effort, like, for example, knowledge to building a nuclear weapon might involve a large investment in resources and complementary knowledge. And so you might think that it's safe to publish if you think that that is out of somebody's reach. Now, there's a line missing at the bottom, so I'll just look through and see what that might be. Oh yes, the last factor, which I'm sorry you can't see there. Put it down to my poor skills in making slides. The last factor is transferability, the ability of knowledge that promotes good ends to be transferred to bad ends. Moving on, there are factors affecting the defender's ability. Defenders means here anybody who's seeking to combat some weakness in technology or some misuse of technology. So it could be somebody inside the organization producing the AI material, or it could be outsiders, users, hackers, spies. And disclosure could aid defenders by disseminating ideas that are useful for finding solutions, or could simply sound an alarm. We'll see some examples of that in a moment. Success depends on a number of factors. Once again, counterfactual possession comes up. Would the defenders independently discover or otherwise obtain the knowledge? How easily could the defenders have got to that insight themselves? Would the defenders have already been aware of the problem? You don't want to announce a problem which nobody else knows about necessarily. Once again, the ability to absorb and apply the information, as with the case of bad actors. And then if you give the disclosure, make the disclosure, how many additional individuals or organizations will work on finding a solution? Do you think you can mobilize a lot of people? That's an argument in favor of disclosing. The positive effects of disclosure depend on the potential for a good defense against the misuse. Is the weakness baked into the fundamentals of the system? Or could a relatively superficial change remove it? Is the attack, I should really say, is an attack detectable? And is detection sufficient to defend against it or to deter it? Is the attack so powerful that it will overwhelm any defenses? Even where a solution to some problem with your disclosure exists, it might be difficult or costly to propagate that solution. That is a factor you have to take into account. Okay, so we're still continuing. So at this very high abstract level, we'll get more concrete, I promise you. Whoops, sorry. So they just talk about the offence-defence balance. For misuse risks that have a higher potential harm, for example, a vulnerability in Facebook could be very harmful, whereas vulnerability in a much smaller website would have less consequence. So in the case of the higher potential harm, the security consequences of disclosure will be amplified. And AI researchers can choose to publish more or less of their basic results and their insights, or their detailed results, their code, their data sets, their trained networks. They can choose to publish or not publish tools, easy to use tools that will assist people outside. These are things within their control. Different outputs will differentially benefit different actors. A publication without practical tools or code will be more difficult for low capability attackers and defenders to apply. Researchers could attempt to play safe to give their release a defensive bias, in other words, being cautious, by differentially publishing defensive tools and best practice as opposed to offensive tools and, I suppose, less than best practice. And they can also, possibly the most practical of these, is that they can attempt to circulate certain knowledge or tools exclusively among the scientific community. In other words, trying to have a privileged circle with which amongst whom you circulate certain knowledge. Interesting question as to how long that would last, or maybe it would just give you enough time to develop some sort of defense against what other people would do. They now contrast different fields. They're interested in how AI might differ from other fields. And so they say that their framework helps to explain why the disclosure of software vulnerabilities will often be beneficial for computer security. In other words, why disclosure has become the norm with software vulnerabilities. One factor is that patches to software are often easy to create and often can be made in a matter of weeks. So fixes are easy to make, generally. These patches fully resolve the vulnerability. They can be completely efficient. The patch can be easily propagated. And independent discovery of the vulnerability is likely. So if that's likely, then you might as well disclose. These factors combine to make a reasonable argument in favor of public disclosure of software vulnerabilities, at least after the vendor has been given time to prepare a patch. Contrast this with other fields. For example, biological research into pathogens. If you create a new virus and if you release information about its genome, say, or even samples, it's difficult to find vaccines against new viruses or treatments against their effects. It's laborious and success is not guaranteed. Very contemporary. So this lowers the defensive benefit of publication. It weakens this argument that that knowledge is good, public knowledge is good. This contrasts with the case where an effective treatment can be developed within a reasonable time period. which could weigh in favor of publication. They give a couple of examples of vulnerabilities involving hardware. They mention drones. Drones are now becoming very widespread. They're used a lot. They are sometimes used maliciously. They have been used in attacks in the Middle East, and I don't know of any physical attacks, outside actual war locations. But anyway, they presently lack a cheap, effective solution, according to the authors. Obviously, you can shoot them down, but they're very cheap, easy to produce in large numbers, and you can't guarantee always to hit them before they hit their target. They also give another analogy, which is sort of amusing and interesting in the hardware field. It seems a lot of hotels, apartment buildings, offices, and so on still use physical key systems, individual keys for individual rooms, and a master key that will open any room. I thought everybody was using electronic swipe cards nowadays, but apparently not so. Or at least not back in 2003. Maybe in 2003, some ingenious fella published a system in which made it easy for someone to create a master key from a single example of one non-master key, one room key, say. He showed how it was possible to make a master key from that, and he was kind enough to publish full details everywhere. And locksmiths and people who ran large buildings were not pleased with this at all, because if somebody takes advantage of this information, then really all you can do is replace your whole key system with a non-master key system. Obviously very expensive. I don't know if there's been any progress since then on combating that, or whether they just had to give way to it, whether everybody has just switched to swipe cards. Another example of hardware vulnerabilities is the question of whether engineering research, nuclear engineering research, such as uranium enrichment, which is obviously just one part of the whole process of making bombs, whether that should have been published. I don't know if anybody was in fact arguing for publishing it, but the reasons that militate against publishing it are simply that you increase the ability of an opponent to make bombs and destroy your own cities. Nuclear bombs are a technology against which there's no effective defense. And in fact, I mean, the best known defense is deterrence. Those technologies of defense that do exist would benefit very little from knowing about one piece of the offensive technology, such as uranium enrichment, for example. In other words, a blueprint for the design of a centrifuge does not help one build a better defensive bunker. So their point here, I think, is they're saying this is not a case where publishing some information about how to build centrifuges, that's not going to help you build up your own defenses in any way. You're not going to get a bunch of hackers coming back and saying, okay, now this is how you can improve your defensive by building better defensive bunkers. There's essentially no connection. So that is a consideration against publishing. And so they say that if both a potential defender and a potential attacker are given knowledge that helps them build nuclear weapons, that knowledge is more useful for making an attack than for protecting against an attack. The knowledge is, the jargon is offense biased. That's just to introduce that term, offense biased. Although, of course, there is still the question that okay, so it helps the defender build a deterrent, which is one form of defense. Okay, onward. Excuse me. Right. Disclosure norms. What they're working towards is, a sort of an ethics or a codes of practice, norms for disclosing or not disclosing pieces of information. And they are saying there are norms of disclosure that vary between different fields. I'll hurry along a little bit here, but they mentioned obviously the Manhattan Project was very secretive, more so than locksmiths. Perhaps locksmiths are more secretive nowadays. More secretive than influenza researchers, because influenza researchers tend to share their knowledge, because currently, I guess they're not too concerned about people using their knowledge for biowarfare. Maybe that will change in the near future. Anyway, these classes of researcher are more secretive than those who find vulnerabilities in software. They say there was a culture clash between the researcher who published the flaw in the master key system and the locksmiths who accused him of being irresponsible. The different disclosure cultures exist in the form of default practices. There are different practices in different areas, but also in what they call common refrains, by which they mean standard phrases or cliches or tropes. For example, language about the virtues of studying a problem or the value of users being empowered by disclosures to make decisions for themselves. They're saying that this sort of language comes a little too easily, and we really need to think about it in a specific context. Such language embeds implicit answers to the questions we've raised. Caution should be exercised when importing concepts and language from other fields. Okay, now they come to discuss AI specifically. To the extent that protections against AI misuse require interventions in social systems, then publishing AI research will have a more limited defensive benefit. I'll go on, they have more to say about this. AI is especially prone to interfering in social systems because AI involves automating activity that normally requires human intelligence, the very definition of AI. For example, criminals used artificial speech generation to fake the voice of the CEO of a company over the telephone. This attack exploits the fact that the sound of someone's voice is strong evidence of their identity. Thus, the so-called vulnerability here is our practice of relying on people's voices as evidence of their identity. This is socially useful. It's a deeply ingrained practice. We'd hate to not be able to go on doing that. Excuse me. They say some have responded by suggesting that the research community should simply, quote, warn society, unquote, that individuals may be increasingly shown untrustworthy content. But the language of, quote, let the users decide for themselves, unquote, which is reminiscent of computer security discourse, I'll take the word for it, apparently it is, would lose its empowering sentiment if users become landed with problems which no good solution exists. In other words, they're working towards their conclusion that really the punters are just not in a position to decide for themselves in the field of AI. They say our key suggestion is that AI vulnerabilities will be, on average, harder to patch than software vulnerabilities are. And so AI researchers cannot assume that AI publication will always have a defensive bias. In other words, will not always be for the good. Now, they say a common response is that an AI model that is useful for an attack could simultaneously be useful for detecting these attacks. You recall this was the reason why Grover was published. They said this is to help us learn how to defend ourselves against fake news generated by AI. However, our authors, Chauvelin and Defoe, say, but offensive AI systems can often be trained against detection systems so as to evade them. Thus, when items generated by Grover were pre-filtered by the detection system, the remaining items were harder to detect. As you can imagine, that seems extremely plausible. So I gather that they generated a whole bunch of, say, fake news articles. They threw them against a detection system, presumably also automated. Could be human beings, I suppose. Some were filtered out by that system, but what was left was harder to detect. That's not very hard to doubt, is it? Okay, so this is one reason for not making the detection system freely available. Okay. So continuing to apply their framework to AI. Secondly, even in cases where, sorry, this is following immediately from the previous point. You remember people were saying that detection systems in AI can be useful for defending us against malicious AI, because obviously that's their purpose. And therefore that disclosure of detection systems is a good thing. They're saying, they're continuing by saying another point against this is that even where a detection system can, in theory, detect the AI's activity, it may not be feasible to deploy it. For example, in the particular case of detecting AI-generated voices, it might require a lot of surveillance of calls, a large amount of computation, and a lot of false positives being thrown up in flagging ordinary conversations. Okay. Now there's a discussion of the independent acquisition of AI knowledge, and they apply it, going down to the middle of the page, they apply it to the example of text generation. And they say that where the risk comes from a big actor, a state-led disinformation campaign, obviously they're thinking of the alleged Russian fake news campaigns in the 2016 US election, presidential election, which at least half of America is firmly convinced was responsible for the outcome of the election. When the risks come from a state-led disinformation campaign, one uncertainty is how much these state actors would benefit from the research being disclosed. Because if not much, because they're a big and powerful research organization themselves, then the risks of disclosure are less. In other words, the costs are less, if you like. Nevertheless, this doesn't mean that you can cheerfully disclose secrets of, say, fake news detection, on the grounds that the enemy is so well equipped that you're not helping them much. We have to consider that there are other actors with less access to AI talent and AI compute. And there may also perhaps be very few actors outside the AI research community, which I suppose means the respectable Western community in this case. There may be people outside capable of having the original insights contained in the paper, not so many geniuses out there. And so forth. In some cases, it will be large technology companies who need to prepare defenses. Okay, I won't go on it to unravel that thought. I want to push on to their conclusion. Their conclusion is that our analysis should aid AI researchers in thinking critically about the implications of publishing work that could be misused. The community should grow its toolbox of analogies and concepts so that disclosure norms can be well designed. I think that's what you could say about this paper, that it is talking about analogies and concepts. These are almost like empty boxes into which you can drop specific concrete considerations when you're thinking about a particular problem. And so they're almost talking about the language of this discussion. Now, one challenge, they say, will be building disclosure policies in accordance with a legitimate and effective norm-setting process. So that's what we're trying to work towards, a sort of an ethic, I suppose you could say, of disclosure. And not just an ethic, but also a bunch of agreed policies and principles in connections with disclosure. They also point out that the security impact of disclosure is important, although it's important, should only be considered alongside a host of other considerations. In other words, everything we've been talking about in this paper is still only one aspect of what you should be thinking about in deciding whether to disclose. Sorry, that thought at the top is a slightly floating thought. AI publication must be able to scale and really adapt to more powerful AI capabilities. What they're saying is that we must bear in mind what any policy or principle relating to AI publication has got to be able to adapt to future, more powerful capabilities that will come along. We mustn't be too limited by what we can do today. And they go on to say, our framework should only be one input to an assessment of publication norms, because there are potential, quote, non-security benefits of scientific publication. These include, all the normal benefits of open publication, contributions to economic growth and the quality of life, the advancement of science and its broad societal benefits, better monitoring of scientific investments. In other words, accountability of investment. It leads to internationalism and cosmopolitanism, makes us all broad-minded. It leads to greater civilian control and involvement in science. And also, there are other tools for tackling harmful AI, not just regulating disclosure. The research community can differentially invest in those projects and trajectories that are most socially beneficial. Researchers can invest extra effort in understanding and mitigating the potential harmful uses of their research. In other words, they're being responsible researchers from the beginning, even before they disclose their results. And they can, their efforts can include the crafting of norms and policies to steer the use of AI. And so that's it, and that is the end of their framework.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for your presentation.